of this morning's rollout of the latest CSIS report on U.S. strategy toward Russia. My name is Jeff Rathke. I'm a senior fellow here in the Europe program, and we're really glad to have such a great audience here this morning. Thanks also to Senator Johnson and Kathleen Hicks for getting everything started this morning. We have with us on this panel two members of the project team, as well as one extremely knowledgeable outsider. So let me introduce our panelists quickly, and then we'll get into the report. First, on my left is Lisa Sam, who is a senior fellow in the International Security Program here at CSIS. She was the co-director of this project. And as to her background, she's a former NSC director for NATO and European Strategic Affairs, and a former DoD official. To my right is Dr. Olya Oliker, who directs our Russia and Eurasia program at CSIS and is a senior advisor here. She previously had a long career at RAND, including as director of their Center for Russia and Eurasia. Those of you who are avid consumers of C-SPAN will have seen both Lisa and Olya recently. Olya yesterday before the Senate Armed Services Committee, Subcommittee on Emerging Threats, and Lisa, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Europe Subcommittee, giving testimony just in the last week or so. And then on the far left is retired Brigadier General Peter Zwak, who is a former U.S. defense attaché in Russia and currently the senior research fellow at the National Defense University. So with us, we've got a lot of expertise, and I'd like to get into our report. So over the last 12 months, the project team, which is an interdisciplinary one, people from the International Security Program, Russia-Eurasia program, and our Europe program, have been looking at the big question of, on the one hand, what proposals we would have for a strategy that would secure U.S. and transatlantic interests in the face of the complex challenge that Russia represents. And secondly, to ground that strategy in a deep understanding of Russia's perspectives, its doctrine, and its foreign policy tools, both military, political, economic, and diplomatic. At this point, my job as moderator, I think, is to frame the discussion and get out of the way. So Lisa, let me turn to you first. And at the opening of the report, you connect it to two intersecting challenges, as you put it. One, that Russia is exploiting previously hidden weaknesses within the West's core institutions. And second, that there is also a pattern of increasingly aggressive Russian behavior that is combined with a more traditional opportunism. So, in that light, and at this stage where the new administration hasn't yet rolled out fully elaborated policies toward Russia, we have on the one hand a kind of inertia, continuation of some elements of previous policy, combined with uncertainty. So what do you see as the main elements of strategy that are needed at this point, and how is it different if it is from previous policy? Where do you see changes?
Very good setup for my prepared remarks, Jeff. Thank you. And first, let me say that there are not two, but three members of the Russia project on this stage. Jeff also was a key member of putting this study together and integral, in fact, in the case studies that are included in the report. So, Jeff, you deserve your due credit for that. Before I get into the challenge and the strategy, let me first say a word about a key assumption that was built into this study. First, Russia has stumbled upon a fairly effective mix of conventional and unconventional tools, which we inventory in the study. And they're likely as surprised as we are by the degree of success that they're having. Consider, for example, that Georgia and Ukraine's NATO membership appears indefinitely stalled, that Russia now controls Crimea, that Assad has been pulled back from the brink, that the Ukraine-related sanctions are proving to be a convenient scapegoat for greater structural problems within the Russian economy. And meanwhile, Putin is as popular as ever. Russia's status as an international power player have been renewed. And so what they're doing is working well for them. And it's safe then to assume that Moscow has no intention of stopping now. They're becoming more emboldened over time, not less. They're growing increasingly comfortable, taking more risks. And they're getting better. They're becoming more ambitious. I think if you would have asked anybody in Washington a year ago about the Russia challenge, you may have gotten an answer focused on the eastern flank, perhaps, or maybe the gray zone. And today we are clearly seeing the challenge hitting closer to home, as we heard from Senator Johnson earlier about the election hack. So in short, the problem is not going away anytime soon, and the U.S. and its allies are going to need to do more to gear up and shift their, conceptually shift to accept Russia as a long-term challenge. So second, I think it's important to consider why Russia is doing what it's doing to try to sow instability and undermine the global order. And a lot has been written on this. We've just added a little bit more. But it boils down to a relatively easy answer. It wants to, and it can, without major consequences. And I want to break this down a little bit. It wants to for a variety of reasons that I'm going to let Olya speak to in a little bit. But in general, it's based upon a combination of political and geopolitical considerations, historical grievances, and external threat perceptions. So it wants to. It can. Again, for a variety of reasons, which I'm going to let General Zwack speak to here in a minute, some of which have to do with Russia, but also some of which have to do with us in the West. Russia, for its part, has made major investments in its military capabilities since 2008. But for our part, we have overlooked for too long the degree of disrepair in our core institutions, which has made the West unnecessarily vulnerable to Russian intrusion. And what do I mean by disrepair in Western institutions? Well, I mean the tone and polarization of our politics, our susceptibility to disinformation, our attacks on the free press, the disengagement of our publics who for too long have forgotten about why NATO was created in the first place, why the EU was created. And then, of course, Europe's divestment in defense, a decades-long project, among other things. So Russia is exploiting these weaknesses, and so more concerted action will be necessary to inoculate our societies against Russia's brand of so-called hybrid warfare. So Russia wants to undermine the global order. It's finding itself more capable of doing so. But let's talk for a moment about the without major consequences part of that equation. Because in this study, we state rather forcefully that the West is not doing enough to change Russia's calculus and behavior. While the steps taken by the West since 2014, the Wales and Warsaw Summit, and other decisions that the U.S. has made and contributed bilaterally have been laudable, and they have done a lot to increase defense and deterrence in Europe, they remain insufficient. Russia is still seeing more reward than risk. It is therefore time to increase the credibility of both our threats and our promises, and to lessen our sensitivity to Russia's false indignation and knee-jerk protests to any and all NATO activities. It is time to draw a firmer line. And this brings me to my final point, which is more specifically about the strategy, what to do with it. We offer a comprehensive strategy complete with end, ways, and means, suggested actions of how this could be carried out. It is designed to speak to Putin in the language he best understands, power and resolve, but at the same time avoid miscalculation by finding avenues for cooperation where possible. Like any good strategy, we began by defining U.S. interests, and here we really tried to go back to first principles. We felt it was important to make the case for why the global order is so important, why it benefits us, why it is so important to maintain and contribute to stability in Europe, and why it is important to try to prevent Russia from sowing instability beyond its borders. In support of these objectives, we outline 3 key pillars. So strengthen, contest, and cooperate. First, strengthen. As I previously mentioned, and as we discussed a bit in the discussion with Senator Johnson, the West must shore up its vulnerabilities not simply to Russian coercion, but to all that makes Russian coercion possible. Among other things, this entails practicing what we preach, reinvesting in NATO, pushing more towards NATO-EU cooperation, standing up for human rights and democracy, and building resilience among allies and partners. The second pillar is contest. The United States needs more robust offensive and defensive measures to contest Russia's aggression. Russia's challenging of the international order will not be constrained only by punitive measures imposed after the fact, but must also be shaped by the proactive imposition of a predictable set of policies that makes clear the United States' boundaries and expectations. This means shaping a new relationship paradigm that puts more onus on Russia to comply with international norms rather than simply imposing consequences for breaching them. For example, instead of saying that we will lift sanctions when Russia complies with the Minsk agreements, say that we will raise them until they do. Also engaging in proportional offensive cyber activities, increasing the U.S. military presence in Europe, and doing more to combat Russian propaganda. Finally, cooperate. Cooperating with Russia where it is in our interest is essential. It is simply too big and too important of a country to ignore. In fact, a strong approach in other areas can actually help create leverage for cooperation on our terms. That said, we must approach engagement cautiously, selectively, and with firm limits. Engagement that degenerates into endless accommodation does not serve U.S. interests. For now, the United States may wish to focus on areas such as crisis communication and transparency measures, nuclear nonproliferation and arms control, and working together in the Arctic. And to conclude, changing Russia's behavior will not be quick or easy, but the stakes are simply too high not to try. And that is our report in a nutshell.
Okay, thanks very much,
Yes.
Lisa. Olya, let me turn to you and ask you to break down a bit, what lies behind this challenge. And it's only partly a military challenge. And so it would be really helpful, I think, if you could give us a bit more insight into Russia's objectives and the tools that it prefers to pursue those.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Lisa, for the yeoman's work in pulling all of this together. I mean, it's quite the accomplishment, and Lisa gets a lot of the credit for it, as does the team as a whole. So I'm going to echo a few of the comments she made, but try to take it a little bit from the Russian perspective, or at least one American's view of the Russian perspective. But I'm going to start by saying the Russia challenge is real, and the Russia challenge is broader than Russia. Russia's increased assertiveness on the global stage has come to us alongside, and indeed has been made possible by a range of other challenges facing our societies and our nations, and we can't respond to any of them in a vacuum. This is why the recommendations and the strategy that are presented in this report are in some cases less about Russia than they are about ourselves and our allies, about shoring up the weaknesses that Russia and others have sought to exploit, and about ensuring that our institutions can truly serve our needs as those needs have evolved and will continue to evolve. The point I want to start with is that when we're defining policy towards Russia, we have to remember that for Russia, there's a U.S. challenge. And the U.S. challenge is one in which Russia thinks it's making progress for the first time in a very long time. The Russians, I can't speak for all Russians, but most Russians I know, including ones that tend to think that their government's foreign policy is going well, do not look in the mirror every day and think, I am evil, I am evil, I am evil. The Russians tend to think that their actions are defensive. That's because Russia has, for most of the last 25 years, been pretty confident that U.S. policy was geared to contain it and to limit its influence, and that the NATO countries have been following the U.S. lead, the other NATO countries, in this and in all things. They haven't seen an outstretched hand over the last 25 years. They've seen a hand that's pushing them away at best and punching them in the face at worst. That wasn't our intention. That is what they've seen. So as a result, the Kremlin has seen the post-Cold War order in Europe and the effort to integrate Russia into that order as harmful to Russia's interests. So it's really no surprise that it's sought an alternative to that order, even if it hasn't done a great job of formulating just how that might work. I don't think that Russia's actions in Ukraine in 2014 were initially intended as a mechanism to undermine the post-Cold War order, or to create a standoff with the West. Russia saw itself as finally able to push back at what it perceived as Western encroachment into what it had long described as its area of so-called privileged interests. Ukraine, which has a complicated history with Russia from long before the Soviet period, has always been particularly neuralgic for the Russians. That history is a big part of the reason that Moscow overreacted so strongly and so violently. But then, having taken the actions that it did, Russia got an unexpectedly strong response from Ukraine itself, which shockingly enough did not share Russia's view of it, and an unexpectedly angry one from both the rest of Europe and the United States, which recognized in the threat to Ukraine a threat to the European security order. Russia found itself, after all, in that standoff, and it found that the standoff had advantages as well as costs. After 25 years of combining cooperation with the US with efforts to counter and limit Western action, Moscow has now found that a strategy centered on the latter is more effective in garnering attention, and thus, in a way, the prestige it thought it's due. Sanctions have also presented a convenient way to blame someone else for an economic downturn underway since 2009. They hurt, but they have some advantages. At home and abroad, Moscow has now been able to portray itself as an alternative to the US-led order, which has made many errors, especially over the last 2 decades. And after all those years low on the priority list for many countries, Moscow is suddenly at the top. And to what I suspect, and as Lisa alluded to, was Moscow's own surprise, it has found that a set of tactics and approaches that it's largely stumbled into were having a real chance of, if not weakening that order, at least raising some questions about it. So what were those tactics? One is a comparatively low bar for the use of military force, coupled with judicious use of that force. In Ukraine and Syria, Russia has been able to act militarily when few expected it to, but also to limit its commitments, no part because of constraints on what it actually was capable of. And then it has redefined its goals to match what was actually attainable. Whether or not the goals are sustainable in the long term is, of course, a different question. And I think in both Syria and Ukraine, the long-term risks are very serious. But in the short term, this has worked. Another aspect of Russia's evolving strategy is simply looking for openings, the opportunism Lisa alluded to. Appearances matter, right? So if countries want to show independence from the United States, Russia now presents them with another country they can talk to, meet with, possibly cooperate with. Russia isn't going to lecture them about human rights and democracy. In most cases, Russia doesn't actually have a real agenda country by country. It's simply seeking greater ties and the appearance of influence in the hope that real influence will follow. Just how this plays out remains to be seen, but leaders unhappy with the current state of things might look for better relations with Moscow, and even if for most of them, Assad accepted, it's not clear what Russia offers other than opposition to the status quo. Finally, Moscow is overtly and covertly leveraging information operations and intelligence, political, economic, and diplomatic activity, not always in concert, but always in combination. Russia is looking to affect elections, to raise questions about the legitimacy of democratic processes, and to leverage populist and fringe parties, right and left, though mostly right, to weaken the European Union and NATO. It has found that questioning the narratives of others is far easier than advancing a clear alternative message. Alternative facts have served Russia well. But here, too, what Russia has mainly done is raise its profile. The factors bringing populists to power are domestic and regional. It's important to remember that Russia may exploit them, but it doesn't cause them. So finally, if these tactics have worried many of us here in the West, it's important to also remember that they haven't made Russia feel safer. Indeed, Russia sees the United States and the West as the ones using this complex whole-of-government strategy against them, against Moscow, developing so-called hybrid approaches, they stole the term from us, while enjoying tremendous conventional superiority. Russia worries about a possible war with NATO, and it's working actively to deter that war, including by saber-rattling. It continues to operate in a security dilemma, in which it sees Western steps forward as encroaching threats and steps back as weakness that can and must be exploited. One additional problem we've developed over the last 3 years is that as a result of Russian actions, many in the West have not only started paying attention to Russia, but they've started to see it as a threat. If for most of the last 25 years, the tendency has been to discount Russian actions as spoilerism with limited effects, today we're actually stumbling into our own version of that same security dilemma, the flip side of it, where Westerners see everything the Russians do as intended only to challenge US leadership and US goals. So the challenge that faces us now for moving forward under these conditions it's a pretty big one. I would argue that it can't be overstated. It is an existential challenge. This report outlines a path forward which is carefully calibrated and takes into account the security dilemma. It argues not so much for steps forward or steps back, but for the development of resilience, which, while prioritizing core interests, demonstrating to Russia what those are, and engaging Russia in a genuine dialogue about these things. But I have to underline that this is not an easy task. Success is going to have to require expert diplomacy, unwavering resolve, and no small amount of innovation. It's my fervent hope our country is going to be up to that task. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Julia. Peter, if I could turn to you now and zero in a bit on Russia's military instruments, how those are changing. We know Russia's military expenditure is a fraction of that in the United States, although by at least CIPRI's measures, it's greater than that of the UK or of France or Germany. So what does that give Russia to pursue these objectives that Olia was describing? And how much should we worry? How is this changing?
Yes, again, thank you for the invitation and esteemed guests and audience. Russia, first of all, when you look at its military, let's go back to 2008 with its clumsy but ultimately successful operations in regard to Georgia. They go into a major military reform called the New Look, under then Serdyukov, the MOD chief, and Makarov. And they get a lot done. Leading up till 2014. They slash the officer corps, they do a lot of streamlining. But what we saw from 2014 to 2017 is a substantial increase in both capability and, if you will, operational integration of their forces, their thinking. But in saying this, I want to say that their progress and their achievements are uneven within the military. While much better, there are a lot of issues and almost aspects of their military that's going to take them a long time to overcome. What we saw between 2014 and 2017 is a full, if you will, operational application of virtually all the aspects we know today, including information operations, of both to low-end, sort of conventional gray zone, nonlinear operations in Crimea, Little Green Men. You saw a variation of that in eastern Ukraine and the use of non-attributed main force Russian regulars in there to stave off a separatist defeat later that summer, all non-attributed. A lot of coordination, a lot of military use. And then what you saw starting in late September 15 until now is the full-blown conventional use from strategic to tactical assets, red, white, and blue Russian tricolor in Syria, where they came out and from blackjacks to blackjacks and bears and backfires and Caliber missiles and latest in and later on S-400s deployed. The full, very, 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 if you will, advertised deployment. When you take all of that from 14 to 17, this is a significant increase in capability, applied capability. It's been a proving ground. It's been a testing ground. It's been a mechanism to show their arms to the world. The fact that they showed with the Caliber and other things their capabilities, which you'd think you would keep kind of discreet. And so there was, I think, along with testing out the capabilities, there was also showing the world, hey, we've got this, showing the Russian people. And you've got to remember with the Russians that there's always that front internally, always looking over the shoulder, and you've got to have a positive narrative with the narod, with the people. So all of that together is a significant plus, if you will, for the Russian military, and it is now Vladimir Putin certainly a much more preferred instrument of power, whether through coercion or defensive. Now, economically, though, there are other issues, though, that make this a big challenge. As Jeff talked about, the economy makes it very, very difficult to make a reform throughout the entire military, to include the professionalization of the military. They're struggling. Let's go back to basics. What is Russia? 11 time zones. It's vast. 145 million people, plus or minus. of which about 75% are for the Urals to the west. A long, difficult history, existential threats, historically going all the way back to the Mongols, which I think in today's Russia, still they live in a different framework, a different prism of existential threats than we do, real, perceived, and yes, contrived, which is very, very necessary, especially for the home front. So you also have this Russian military that's pulling a demographic of 145 million, 40% of the United States. A third of the European Union and an eighth of the People's Republics of China. So you're hard pressed to professionalize a military that through call-ups you can't get to 1 million people. There are between 800 and 900,000 active duty military. And now pulling from the same manpower pool is this new National Guard, Zolotev's National Guard, that's being cut out of the hide of the MVD. And then you have the colossal security services and a cohort of only 600, 800 18-year-olds every 1,000 18-year-olds every year. So they have a lot to manage. You talk about existential threats and the sheer breadth of its borders. It's got a lot. So I would submit that today they've been very reactive, very revisionist, out of line in the West. But strategically, they're on the defensive. Now, within that, they're reactively preemptive. And the military increasingly has been built, if you will, to be able to move fast, deep, get somewhere, call a revolution, restore order in a capital that it perceives in its interest, get a regime or government that is favorable, and leave, because with that heavy conscript ground force piece, they're hard pressed to hold, if you will, outside, if you will, deep into the FSU. So they've got a lot going on in Russia. And that economy piece, finally, yes, there are modernizations and very sophisticated things going on, but it's lacking in depth. The triad, the nuclear triad, which is at the heart, if you will, what makes them militarily a superpower. They're increasing, they're improving. They got their new Boroi class missile submarines, but there are only a few. You've got the new Sarmat ICBM that's replacing the SS-18 appropriately in Satan. They're doing it, but it is not deep. Armada tanks, yes, they're out there, they're capable, not a lot of them. You take it across the board, and they're struggling with the economies to close. The sanctions matter in this environment, and the oil prices down, the ruble inflated still are major factors. And I think to close dual track with Russia, we want to find a way, we want to create a world where Russia feels secure, if you will, however we define them, as far as to join, if you will, in some way, the community of nations peacefully. But within that framework, I think the most important thing is we continue to support our alliance, defend our allies, support our partners, set boundaries, and then the other side of that dual track, we're working, we're talking to the Russians, arms control, we're finding ways to lower the temperature and to reduce, if you will, the deep suspicion and distrust in our relationship today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was really terrific. And thank all the panelists for great comments. I'd like to ask a couple of questions and try to draw out a few threads that arose. And Olya, if I could turn to you first, just asking you to respond to something Peter said. I'm not trying to stoke conflict or disagreement, but he said Russia feels strategically on the defensive. I'd be curious your perspective on that, and then if I could connect that to one other thing, which is, I think one of the statements that jumped out at me in the report is that, and it was in your remarks as well, that Russia combines niche capabilities with a low bar for the use of force. And my question then is, what does that mean in light of the challenges Peter described? How scalable is this? And what is it that we should be thinking about for future potential Russian interventions or responses to what they see as foreign policy challenges?
Great, good questions. So in terms of Russia being on the defensive, yes, absolutely. I think Russia sees itself as pushing back, but it's only the beginning of a pushback, and it's very limited And overall, it does see the deck as stacked against it. I mean, it is striking. It's actually striking the extent to which when Russia talks about military and security sector reform, certainly not with the National Guard, but when it's looking at building up its special operations forces, when it looks to responding to more integrated approaches, it creates this 12-foot giant of a Western system that it's fighting against, and that the sole purpose of which may not be to contain Russia, but certainly part of the purpose of which is to contain Russia, limit Russia, keep Russia down and small. And that's what it feels it's responding to. When you look, very few countries do military exercises that simulate aggression. But Russia doesn't just simulate defense, it simulates homeland defense, right? I mean, most of the time what it's thinking is that there's a huge force attacking it with air power and troops going across Russia, which, I don't think that's a big part of US and NATO military planning these days, but that's what they're most scared of. Everybody prepares against capability to a certain extent. Over time, you can reduce the threat level such that capability matters less. We have not done that with the Russians, and so they do very much feel on the defensive. So limitations and a low bar for the use of force. I think this is a really interesting thing to calibrate and to figure out, and I think the Russians are trying to figure it out. We have conflicting data in some ways. On the one hand, the numbers that the Russians put out indicate that their personnel levels are actually pretty good, that they are kind of approaching the point where their units are filled. On the other hand, we've seen the move to allowing people to sign 6-month contracts for service, for military service. It's against Russian law to send conscripts into battle, so they still have a lot of conscripts in their armed forces, but they're not supposed to send them into combat. So in order to send somebody into combat, they have to be a professional, they have to have signed a contract. They've started allowing people to sign contracts that are only 6 months in length. That says to me they're having trouble getting enough people. They don't, if you're doing that, if you're trying to convince somebody, hey, it's only 6 months, you'll make a lot of money, it'll be great, and we're gonna send you to Syria, you have a personnel fill problem. So I think this is an interesting question, and I think the other thing that the Russians face is while they've been able to keep these operations limited, Ukraine especially has a real risk of growth. And one of the interesting things here is that if Ukraine goes badly, it is highly unlikely that Western countries are going to come in militarily to try to stabilize it. It is very highly likely that Russia will face a lot of pressure to do that. And then Russia gets spread very thin because Ukraine isn't going to be a pleasant place for the Russians to operate in that way. And I think they are aware of this. And I think in many ways they're aware of the many downsides of the Ukraine operation and its potential to bite back. If something like that happens, Russia doesn't have a lot of room to do much else. And if Russia does something else without resolving Ukraine, again, where is it going to bring the forces from? Where is it going to bring the equipment from? How much of it is it going to risk? It can't all be a big arms sales commercial like Syria. Ukraine isn't a big arms sales commercial like Syria. So I think those are all the things we want to be watching, and I think those are the things the Russians are watching. But remember, they're not looking for opportunities to have another fun military operation. In both Syria and Ukraine, they acted out of specific interests that they saw in those areas. So I think the other question is, where are they going to feel threatened? Where are they going to feel that their interests are under pressure? And there, what can they do with military capability, particularly limited military capability, to attain their goals?
Thanks. Lisa, you started off, the very first element of the strategy is institutional and our links with our allies in Europe. And so I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about that, and in particular, if we bring out the element of election interference and sort of non-military destabilizing action, cyber-enabled influence operations, essentially. What's the role of allies? What should we be doing with allies? To what degree is that institutional? How do How do you see that recommendation more fully?
Yes, well, thank you for that question. I do think, when we say it in the report, that our alliances are the United States' greatest foreign policy advantage that this country has. And so we should be going to great pains to protect those relationships, to tend the garden, so to speak, to meet with them, to speak to them, to make sure that they understand the depth of the U.S. commitment to their security. I think we have a lot of nervous friends in Europe right now. Secretary Tillerson will be meeting with them tomorrow at a NATO ministerial, so hopefully he can express commitment and make them feel reassured about where the U.S. stands when it comes to NATO and Europe. But it's, as you said, we need to be doing things across the spectrum to not only enhance their defenses, but share lessons learned with them, especially when it comes to cyber. To build resilience within their own institutions and also the ones that we are a part of, namely NATO. Yes, we need to keep their feet to the fire when it comes to defense spending, but we also need to be doing it in a way that is constructive and not deconstructive, that shows appreciation for the contributions that they do make. Allies, for all the trouble we give them, do still contribute an aggregate annual defense spending of $300 million. So,
billion, you mean?
Sorry, billion. The United States is about $600 billion. Allies add about $300 billion on top of that. Correct me if I'm wrong, sir, but the Russian defense military budget is about 65.
It's about an eighth or ninth of it, yeah. It's not a lot.
So this is, the Allies are adding a lot of capability, a lot of value, and I think we do a disservice when we forget not only about what they bring to the table, the legitimacy that they give us in our operations, but also, that they extend our own global reach. By having U.S. forces in Europe, it makes the United States safer. It makes us better able to confront challenges before they cross an ocean and reach U.S. shores. We do $1 trillion of trade in goods and services with Europe every year. That supports an estimated 2.4 million U.S. jobs. We are not in Europe for the benefit of Europe. This is not charity. We are in Europe for the security of the United States.
Okay, great. I'd love to turn to the audience now, and we'll give people a moment or two to get their hands up. And I'll ask you to give us your name and your affiliation, and to ask a clearly formulated question. If you want to deliver a comment, that can be done tomorrow. But for today, we'll go to that. And we'll take a couple together and then give the panelists a chance to respond to those. So I think we'll start here on this side.
Hi, thank you for a very, very interesting talk, and I'm sure the report will be as well. My name is Katie Fox. I'm with the, the National Democratic Institute. I am interested in the comments that you've all made about the difference in perception of the Russians' perception, particularly the leadership, how they feel. They don't see an outstretched arm, they feel distrust, they feel a threat, and how important it is to change that perception. So my question is, how do you do that? And if it really is possible to do it, how have successive American administrations so badly failed to do it up to now?
Okay, great, thanks. We'll take a gentleman in the back here in the middle.
Sure. Hi, following up directly on that, immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union...
Sorry, could you identify yourself?
Oh, sorry, James Siebens, Stimson Center.
Okay.
After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russians basically pushed for an enlarged role for the OSCE. I wonder if you think that might be a mechanism of actually extending that olive branch.
Okay, great. And then on this side, the far right.
Yes, my name is George McGregor. I'm over from London for a few days. There is a brilliant event. There is, of course, a delicious irony here. We're rightfully condemning Vladimir Putin for meddling in European affairs. Last week he was entertaining Marine Le Pen, and he's definitely going to take advantage of Brexit. But of course, in the United States, we have President Trump meddling in European affairs and encouraging Brexit and encouraging other countries to follow their lead, which will destabilise Europe and make us less able to counteract any Russian threat. Juncker said today in Malta that if Trump continues to meddle in European affairs, then he's going to start a campaign for Ohio and Texas to leave the United States. Now, clearly that's his attempt at humour, but it's an incredibly serious situation, and I would welcome the comments. How do we rail in President Trump, is my question.
Okay, so with that palette in front of you, I'll start Lisa with you, and then Peter and Olya.
Yes, so I'm going to leave the Russian perception question to the Russia experts on this panel and skip ahead to the OSCE. I do think there is a role for the OSCE. They have clearly stepped up when it has come to Ukraine. Their monitors are out there. They're in the firing lines. I think under the OSCE, we also have the Vienna documents. I mean, we may want to think about how we can evolve that document forward, perhaps lowering the notification threshold for exercises and other things, but clearly it's another opportunity where we can sit around a table with the Russians and discuss things, and I think that's always a good idea. On the how to reel in Trump question, well, if I only knew, I would. I think it's going to be, some of this is just going to have to be learning on the job. I think a lot of what we have seen so far has perhaps stemmed from misunderstanding or not being fully briefed or things like that. So I think the more that he can get his staff in place, you know, we have heard names of very good people that will be going into very high places in the White House and others, that if he will rely on those people and their expertise and experience and advice, then you know, that may be one way. But in terms of controlling the Twitter account, I do not know.
Peter.
Yeah, as far as the OSCE and other international organizations, fundamentally stability-based organizations, you know, we should continue to support them. They're important. We saw OSCE in Ukraine. I saw them a lot in the Balkans. Yeah, we'll say they're flawed and all of that, but you know what? They're there, and it's a venue, and it's a forum, and they do good things. And I say that even with the United Nations, with all the warts it has. But when we talk about stability-based organizations, also the EU and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO, to me, is the core alliance of our civilization. And I would go back to our Russian colleagues and say, do you think, Russia, that you would be safer in a world without the EU and NATO? Understanding European history as well as you do, and what can happen in the West when you don't have stability internally, it usually doesn't work out well for Russia in the long term. So OSCE and all of that, I think we need to continue to work those formats, support them. Obviously, where there is a need for reform, especially in UN. And then, sir, on your question about the you know, lowering the temperature again. Again, I mentioned it earlier. I think that every venue look, our relationship. We have fewer, less conduits and discussion points with the Russians than we did in the heart of the Cold War, and that's dangerous. And it doesn't necessarily mean we agree on everything, but if you can maintain some conduits, you get some understanding. You can't, without those dialogues, you can't even start working on solutions. So again, support defend your allies, support your partners, strong dialogue at every possible venue. I think that's critical.
If I can add one element to that, as I hand the mic figuratively to you, Olya, is the question of engagement. Because within the OSCE, of course, for the last well over a year, you've had proposals for updating the Vienna document, for example. And Russia hasn't been terribly interested in engaging those. So is this a venue problem, or is this a fundamental lack of interest problem? And because I think that's, Peter makes an extremely important point about the need for channels of communication to reduce risks. But when those aren't taken up, then how do you go forward?
So a lot of good questions. So in terms of changing Russia's perceptions, I think Peter's question to the Russians is a great one. The Russians have consistently ducked it. I think Russia has, for a quarter century, proven remarkably difficult to reassure, at least by the United States and its NATO allies. And I think at this stage in the game, I am not optimistic about reassurance per se. I don't think we're going to convince them that we're actually friendly, and I don't think they're going to convince us that they're actually friendly. What I think we can do is manage the relationship where we are blunt and upfront about our interests and our goals and why we have them. They are the same to us, and we negotiate it out. And we don't negotiate over the heads of others. We bring them into the conversation. We have these very, very difficult conversations in which there's going to be a lot of disagreement. And the OSCE can certainly be one venue for that. I think, in terms of the question on the Vienna document and updating it, I think Russia's disinterest in it right now is tactical, that they have advantages for not revisiting it just at present. You could change the incentives and create an interest on Russia's part. These are the conversations that have to happen. But it's over time, then you might get to a place of greater reassurance. But we've had a quarter century and we've had a hard time getting there. So at this point, I'm going to go for management rather than hoping for the best. And I will stop there.
Okay.
And the only thing I'll add is that we do talk about this concept of so-called escalate to negotiate. That if we, and the interaction between the lines of effort that I laid out, so the more forcefully we may be able to be in the contest line of effort, the better it may be for efforts to cooperate down the road on other issues.
Though if I can jump in on that, communication is very critical to doing that well, yes. Because the danger of escalation, of course, is that it spirals. And we are in a very scary place right now with the two countries that have well over 90% of the world's nuclear weapons, practicing a certain amount of brinksmanship. That shouldn't make you feel good. So we do need to find a way back from that. But I agree. Resolve is very critical, and prioritization is very critical, right? We fight for the things we care about. We don't fight for the things we don't care about. And I don't think we have been as clear about that as we could have been.
Which I think addresses also the last question about communication. So if I could take a headline from that, we weren't here to make you feel good this morning, but we were here to make you feel better informed. And I hope we've achieved that. I think we've had some great contributions this morning from Senator Johnson and Kathleen Hicks, and also from this panel. So I would like to do three things right now. First, I'd like to thank the Smith-Richardson Foundation for supporting this project, which was essential to doing it. Second, I'd like to thank the panelists and everyone else on the project team for a really great report. And third, I'd like to thank you for coming here and participating today. And with that, we will sign off and wish all of you a good day and wish you all the best.